Mexico's history is deeply rooted in its indigenous peoples. From the very first humans who set foot in the region to the thriving civilizations that arose long before Europeans arrived, the land that is now Mexico has seen a vast tapestry of cultures, languages, and societies. Over thousands of years, numerous indigenous groups developed rich traditions and complex social structures. As genetic research now confirms, these ancient peoples are not merely figures of the past. They form the majority of the ancestry of modern Mexicans. In fact, scholars note the tremendous language and cultural diversity across Mexico, with large empires like the Aztec and Maya, as well as small, isolated populations coexisting over millennia. This narrative will journey through a broad chronological sweep, from the arrival of the first people in Mexico and the rise of early cultures, such as the Olmec, Zapotec, Mixtec, and many more, to the Mexican genetic legacy and contemporary indigenous identity. The goal is to show that even after colonialism, Mexico remains overwhelmingly indigenous in its heritage, demography, and identity. First peoples arrive in Mexico. Long before the idea of Mexico existed, the region was home to some of the first people to inhabit the Americas. During the last ice age, hunter-gatherers migrated from Asia into North America, likely crossing the Bering Land Bridge and spreading southward. For much of the 20th century, the prevailing theory was that humans arrived in the interior of the continent around 13,000 years ago, once ice sheets retreated enough to open a migration corridor. Indeed, evidence of Paleo-Indian presence, such as Clovis-style spear points, suggest humans were widespread in North America by around 11,000 to 13,000 years ago. However, recent discoveries have pushed the timeline of human arrival much further back. In central Mexico's highlands, archaeologists excavating Chiquite Cave unearthed stone tools in layers dated to the last glacial maximum. These findings suggest that people may have been living in what is now Mexico at least 26,500 years ago, potentially well before the glacial ice would have allowed migration through North America. The lead researcher, Cyprian Ardelin, argues that for humans to have reached central Mexico by that time, they likely entered the Americas even earlier, perhaps over 30,000 years ago. While such early dates are controversial and not yet fully accepted by all scientists, they align with other emerging evidence, like ancient footprints in New Mexico and early sites in South America, suggesting the Americas were peopled earlier than traditionally thought. What is clear is that by around 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, if not earlier, indigenous peoples were present throughout Mexico. These Paleo-Indians initially lived as nomadic foragers, hunting now extinct megafauna and gathering wild plants. Over time, they adapted to the diverse environments of the region, from the arid deserts of the north to the tropical forests of the south, developing localized cultures and survival strategies. As the climate warmed and Pleistocene megafauna disappeared, the indigenous peoples of Mexico transitioned to new ways of life. One of the most pivotal changes was the domestication of plants, which laid the foundation for agriculture and settled life. Maize, or corn, was first domesticated by indigenous farmers in southern Mexico about 9,000 years ago from a wild grass called teosinte. This agricultural revolution was gradual. Early farming likely began as small garden plots supplementing foraging, but by 5000 to 3000 BCE, maize, along with squash and beans, became staple crops in many regions. Archaeological sites such as Nacuit's Cave in Oaxaca have yielded early domesticated squash seeds and maize cobs, indicating that by 4300 BCE, the cultivation of these crops was underway. With agriculture came sedentary villages and population growth. In the Tehuacan Valley and other parts of central Mexico, archaeologists have identified some of the earliest farming communities in the Americas. By around 2000 BCE, small villages of pit houses or wattle and daub huts dotted fertile valleys. People still supplemented their diets by hunting deer or fishing, but farming enabled more reliable food surpluses. Over generations, societies became more complex. Population density increased, social roles diversified, and regional trade networks emerged. For example, obsidian for tools and shells for ornamentation were traded over long distances. Early ceremonial centers also appeared in this period, reflecting a growing spiritual and communal life tied to the agricultural calendar. By 1800 to 1500 BCE, in what archaeologists call the early preclassic period, larger villages with public architecture were present in parts of Mesoamerica, the cultural region spanning central and southern Mexico and northern Central America. It was in this context that the first true cities and civilizations of Mexico would soon rise. The Olmec, Mexico's first civilization. One of the earliest and most influential of these civilizations were the Olmecs, often regarded as Mesoamerica's mother culture. The Olmec society blossomed along the Gulf Coast of Veracruz and Tabasco, with their culture's heyday roughly 1200 to 400 BCE. Archaeologists identify the Olmecs as an archaeological culture, since our knowledge of them comes from artifacts rather than written texts. The very name Olmec was given by modern scholars, derived from a Nahuatl word, Olmecatl, meaning rubber people, a reference to the rubber-bearing region they inhabited. At sites like San Lorenzo, flourishing circa 1150 to 900 BCE, and La Venta, circa 900 to 500 BCE, the Olmecs built the earliest known monumental architecture in Mexico. They are famous for their colossal stone heads, enormous helmeted sculptures weighing many tons, whose creation required remarkable skill and organization. These heads, carved from basalt boulders transported from distant quarries, likely depict Olmec rulers and have become an icon of ancient Mexico. The Olmecs also produced other massive monuments, such as altars or thrones and stelae, and they may have originated the Mesoamerican ritual ball game, as ball court remains and rubber balls have been found at Olmec sites. Culturally, the Olmecs laid many foundations. They developed a distinctive art style, famous for baby-faced figurines and jaguar human motifs, engaged in long-distance trade, exchanging jade, obsidian, serpentine, and other prestige goods, and may have had early forms of writing and calendrics. The Cascajal block, a serpentine slab with incised symbols, is a candidate for the earliest writing in the Americas, dated to Olmec times. The Olmec civilization's influence radiated throughout Mesoamerica. Later cultures like the Maya, Zapotec, and others inherited or were inspired by the Olmec innovations in city building, religion, and art. It is for this reason that the Olmecs are often called the mother culture of the region, as many traditions in Mesoamerica can be traced back to the Olmec heritage. By about 400 BCE, the major Olmec centers had declined, possibly due to environmental changes or social turmoil. Yet the legacy of the Olmecs lived on in emerging civilizations that took root in different parts of Mexico.
The Zapotec civilization of Monte Alban. While the Olmecs thrived on the Gulf Coast, another civilization was taking shape in the southern highlands. The Zapotec civilization emerged in the Valley of Oaxaca and is notable for establishing one of the first major cities in Mesoamerica, Monte Alban. Founded around 500 BCE atop a commanding hilltop, Monte Alban became the political and cultural heart of the Zapotec people. Over the next several centuries, this city grew into an imperial dominion. By about 100 BCE to 200 CE, Monte Alban controlled large swaths of the Oaxacan highlands and interacted with other great centers like Teotihuacan in central Mexico. Monte Alban was continuously occupied for more than 1,300 years, 500 BCE to 850 CE. At its peak during the Classic period, circa 250 to 750 CE, Monte Alban was a thriving urban hub. The Zapotec built impressive stone temples, palaces, plazas, and even ball courts on the artificially flattened mountaintop. Today, visitors to the ruins can see grand plazas surrounded by platform mounds, a large ball court, and over 170 tombs of elite individuals. The Zapotec elite left behind carved stones called danzantes, depicting bound captives or possibly ancestors, and extensive hieroglyphic inscriptions, making Monte Alban home to one of the earliest writing systems in the Americas. In fact, glyphs on stelae at Monte Alban with calendrical dates are among the oldest known texts in Mesoamerica. This suggests the Zapotec developed writing independently or concurrently with the Olmec or early Maya by at least the late pre-classic period. Zapotec society was highly organized, with a ruling class that likely controlled surrounding valleys from Monte Alban. The city's strategic hilltop location and defensive walls hint at warfare and dominance over neighboring communities. Yet, Monte Alban also shows evidence of influence from or interaction with other cultures. Archaeologists have found a carved monument at Monte Alban called Monument 13 that depicts the symbols of other towns it claims to have conquered, indicating a Zapotec expansion. Also, a distinctive feature is Monte Alban's Galería de los Danzantes, Gallery of the Dancers, stone carvings that may represent war captives from rival peoples. By the late Classic, around 700 to 800 CE, Monte Alban's power waned. The city was largely abandoned by 750 CE, around the same time many Classic-era cities were collapsing across Mesoamerica. However, the Zapotec people themselves were far from gone. They remained in the Oaxacan region, living in smaller centers. In later centuries, Zapotecs coexisted and sometimes competed with their neighbors, the Mixtecs, and resisted Aztec encroachment until the Spanish arrival. Importantly, Zapotec civilization had developed a calendar and writing, and their cultural traditions persisted, making them one of the continuous indigenous cultures of Mexico from ancient times to today. The Maya civilization. No account of Mexico's indigenous history would be complete without the Maya, famed for their advanced knowledge and artistry. The Maya civilization covered a vast area in southeastern Mexico, Chiapas, Yucatan Peninsula, and parts of Central America, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Maya cultural roots go back to at least 1500 BCE, when early Maya were already farming villages and developing astronomy. Over many centuries, the Maya world saw the rise and fall of numerous city-states rather than one unified empire. The classic period of Maya civilization, circa 250 to 900 CE, was its golden age. During this era, more than 40 Maya cities flourished, each an independent kingdom with populations of 5,000 to 50,000 or more. In what is today Mexican territory, major classic Maya sites included Palenque, Yaxchilan, Calakmul, and Coba, among others, and just over the border in Guatemala were the great cities of Tikal and Copan. Maya achievements were astounding. They built towering step pyramids and palaces in stone, devised a logosyllabic script, one of the most sophisticated scripts of the pre-Columbian world, and created a complex calendar system famous for its accuracy. They excelled in astronomy and mathematics. The Maya understood the concept of zero and could predict solar eclipses. Politically, the Maya cities engaged in alliances and warfare. Inscriptions tell of dynastic king lists and battles between rival cities. The Maya were deeply religious, worshipping a pantheon of gods tied to nature and time. They performed elaborate rituals, including bloodletting and offerings to maintain cosmic order. Art and architecture reached great heights. Colorful murals, carved stone monuments, stelae with hieroglyphs, and exquisite jade craftsmanship. Each city had its own style. For example, Palenque is noted for its elegant architecture and historical inscriptions, while Tikal is known for its massive temple pyramids rising above the rainforest canopy. Around 800–900 CE, the classic Maya cities in the southern lowlands experienced a mysterious decline, possibly due to drought, ecological strain, warfare, and social upheaval. Many of the great cities were abandoned. However, Maya civilization did not vanish. In the post-classic period, 900 to 1521 CE, new centers in the Yucatan Peninsula, such as Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Mayapan, continued to flourish for several centuries. These later Maya cities saw increased influence from central Mexican cultures. For instance, Chichen Itza has a mix of Maya and Toltec styles. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, there were still vibrant Maya city-states, such as the Itza capital, Nochpeten and Peten Itza, and others, some of which resisted conquest until the late 1600s. The Maya legacy is profound. Not only do their ruined cities awe visitors today, but the Maya people themselves endured the colonial period and continue to live in Mexico and Central America. Maya languages are still spoken by over 5 million people today, a strong testament to cultural continuity. In southern Mexico, Chiapas, Yucatan, Quintana Roo, and Campeche, there are large Maya-speaking populations, such as Yucatec Maya, Tzeltal, Tzotzil, Chol, etc., preserving many aspects of their ancestors' identity, even as they have adapted to modern life. Teotihuacan and the cities of central Mexico. While the Maya thrived in the southeast, central Mexico saw its own great urban civilization. The most notable was Teotihuacan, located in the Valley of Mexico, northeast of modern Mexico City. Teotihuacan was established around 200 BCE, but it grew exponentially in the 1st centuries CE to become the largest city in the Americas of its time. At its zenith, circa 400 to 600 CE, Teotihuacan's population is estimated at 100,000 to 200,000, making it one of the largest cities in the world in the 5th century. The city was meticulously planned, with a grid layout and monumental structures along the Avenue of the Dead. 2 massive pyramids still dominate the site today: the Pyramid of the Sun, one of the largest pyramids in the world, and the Pyramid of the Moon, as well as the Ciudadela complex with the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, or Quetzalcoatl. Teotihuacan's influence was felt across Mesoamerica. It was a cosmopolitan center that engaged in far-flung trade. For example, its obsidian was exported widely. Archaeological evidence shows a Teotihuacan presence or influence in regions as far as the Maya lands. Example, Teotihuacan-style pottery and architecture at Tikal, Kaminaljuyu, etc. We do not know the ethnicity or language of Teotihuacan's founders. They might have been a multi-ethnic society, including Nahuatl-speaking groups or others. They left behind murals and artifacts, but no known writing system to tell their story. What we do know is that Teotihuacan was likely governed by powerful elites who controlled its trade and religion. The city's patron deity may have been the storm or rain god and a form of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god. Mysteriously, Teotihuacan was abandoned by the 7th or 8th century. There's evidence of deliberate burning in parts of the city around 550 CE, suggesting internal strife or invasion. After Teotihuacan's collapse, central Mexico went through a period of fragmentation, but new powers soon emerged in the Epiclassic and Post-Classic periods. One of these were the Toltecs, centered at Tula, or Tolan, in what is now Hidalgo. The Toltec civilization, circa 900 to 1150 CE, was renowned in later Mexican lore as a great artifice of civilization. The Aztecs revered the Toltecs as sages and master builders. Tula had impressive columned halls and giant warrior statues, the Atlantean figures. The Toltecs also are associated with spreading the cult of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, which later became integral to Aztec mythology. Some legends say a Toltec king, Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, was exiled and would one day return, a story the Aztecs knew on the eve of the Spanish arrival. Some Aztec accounts mistakenly linked Cortés to this prophecy. Meanwhile, in West Mexico, other cultures thrived, such as the Purépecha, also known as the Tarascans, around Lake Pátzcuaro, Michoacán. The Purépecha built a strong kingdom contemporaneous with the Aztecs, famous for their metalworking. They knew metallurgy earlier than central Mexico, and for successfully repelling Aztec invasions. The Aztecs never conquered the Tarascan state. In northern Mexico and the desert regions, many semi-nomadic tribes, often called Chichimecas by the Nahua, lived by hunting, gathering, and later herding, but some formed settled cultures with pottery and villages, such as Baquime in Chihuahua in the 13th and 14th centuries, known for its adobe complex, and traded macas and turquoise. These northern cultures are part of Aridoamérica, distinct from the agricultural pueblos of Mesoamerica.
The Mixtec civilization of Oaxaca. Parallel to these central Mexican powers, the Mixtecs, Mixteca, meaning cloud people in Nahuatl, developed a remarkable civilization in Oaxaca and nearby areas. The Mixtecs share the Oaxacan highlands with the Zapotecs, and their history intertwined over centuries. By the post-classic period, after 800 CE, the Mixtecs became dominant in parts of Oaxaca, particularly in the western region known as the Mixteca. They were never a single unified empire. Rather, the Mixtecs were organized into independent city-states and kingdoms, often centered on fortified hilltop towns. The Mixtecs are celebrated as master artisans and scribes of Mesoamerica. The Mixtecs were skilled artisans, known for making beautiful metalwork, jewelry, and decorated vessels. They were among the finest goldsmiths in the Americas.
beautifully worked Mixtec gold ornaments and treasures, many of which were found in Tomb 7 at Monte Alban, astonished the archaeological world. The Mixtecs likely learned metalworking techniques via trade routes from South America and developed them to a high art, creating jewelry and ritual objects in gold, silver, and copper. Crucially, the Mixtecs also kept histories in painted codexes. They, like the Maya and Aztecs, used a pictographic writing system. Mixtec codices, screenfold books made of deer hide that survived the Spanish conquest, form one of our best sources on pre-Hispanic history. For example, the Codex Zuch Natal and Codex Vindonvenensis chronicle genealogies and epic narratives of Mixtec kings and heroes. The Mixtecs use codices to record their history, beliefs, and stories about their ancient kings, recounts one archaeology summary. These vividly illustrated manuscripts show scenes of royal marriages, wars, and alliances. Through them, we know of legendary Mixtec figures like Lord Eight Deer Jaguar Claw, a famous 11th century ruler who forged a Mixtec empire through conquest and diplomacy. His exploits are detailed in the Codex Natal. By the time the Aztecs, Mexica, rose in central Mexico, 14th, 15th centuries, the Mixtecs were prominent in Oaxaca's highlands and the Puebla region. There were dozens of Mixtec city-states. Sometimes they fought each other. Other times they allied, even marrying into Zapotec noble families. The Mixtec and Zapotec often competed for power in Oaxaca. For instance, in the post-classic era, the Mixtecs took control of the old Zapotec capital, Monte Alban, repurposing some of its tombs for their own elites, like Tomb 7, reused around 1300 CE, yielding a spectacular cache of Mixtec treasures. When the Aztec Mexica Empire expanded south, they encountered both Zapotec and Mixtec realms. The Aztecs managed to conquer some Mixtec kingdoms or force them to pay tribute, especially in the Mixtec of Baja and parts of modern Guerrero, but other Mixtec lords remained semi-autonomous, owing nominal allegiance or cleverly negotiating with the powerful Aztec Triple Alliance. Notably, many Mixtec city-states were still strong on the eve of the conquest, and some joined forces with the Spaniards against the Aztecs. It's worth noting that the Mixtec region was densely populated and prosperous by the time of European contact. An estimate is that in 1522, the Mixteca had over 1 million inhabitants, living in numerous towns and cities, a testament to how successful their agriculture and social organization were. In summary, the Mixtec civilization, though less famous to the general public than the Maya or Aztec, was one of the great indigenous cultures of Mexico. Their legacy is preserved not only in archaeology, but also in those precious surviving codexes and the living Mixtec people of today who continue to speak their language and practice their traditions. The Aztec Mexica Empire. The Aztec Empire was the last great pre-Hispanic power in Mexico before the Spanish arrived. In a sense, the Aztecs, who they called themselves Mexica, saw themselves as heirs to the civilizations that came before. They admired the legacy of Teotihuacan and the Toltecs, and claimed descent from the prestigious Toltec lineage. The Mexica were a Nahuatl-speaking people who, according to their own legends, migrated from a northern homeland, Aztlán, to the Valley of Mexico. There, after years of serving more powerful tribes, they founded their own city in 1325 CE, Tenochtitlan, built on islands in Lake Texcoco. This unlikely marshy setting became the capital of an empire and one of the world's most impressive cities by the early 16th century. Tenochtitlan grew rapidly under the Mexica, who formed the Triple Alliance with two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, in 1428. Under successive warrior kings, the Aztecs expanded militarily. They conquered or intimidated much of central and southern Mexico, from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, and demanded tribute from vassal cities. The Aztec Empire was not a unitary state, but a hegemonic system. Subject peoples paid regular tribute in goods, food, cotton, gold, jade, etc., and captives for sacrifice, but generally kept their local rulers. By 1519, the Aztec Emperor Huetletoani Moctezuma II ruled over a realm of perhaps 5 to 6 million people, though many subject cities resented Aztec domination. The empire's reach did not extend to the far south. The Maya Highlands, the west, the Purépecha Tarascan Empire remained independent, or the north beyond the frontiers of settled agriculture. Nevertheless, it was the largest indigenous polity in North America at that time. Aztec society was highly stratified. A noble class, the people dominated politics and the priesthood, while commoners, the Masahuales, farmed, built, and fought as soldiers.
Tenochtitlan itself astonished the Spaniards with its size. Estimates range from 200,000 to possibly 300,000 inhabitants. Great twin temples, such as the Temple of Mayor, canals and causeways, bustling markets like Tlatelolco Market, and wealth. The Mexica were fierce warriors, and warfare and sacrificial religion were central to their culture. They worshiped gods such as Huitzilopochtli, the patron of the Mexica, god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, rain god, and believed the sun required human hearts and blood to sustain its course, thus fueling their ritual of sacrifice, often of war captives. The very name Mexico comes from the Mexica people. The Spanish applied the name Mexico from the Nahuatl Mexico, which was the name of the Aztec capital's region, to the entire colony of New Spain. As one historian notes, Mexico gets its name from the Nahuatl-speaking Mexica, who are otherwise known as Aztecs. This is a reminder that the modern nation carries an indigenous name and heritage at its core. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés and his band of Spanish conquistadors landed on the Gulf Coast, they encountered a land rich with many peoples and rife with rivalries. Famously, Cortés aligned with the Tlaxcalans, bitter enemies of the Aztecs and other tributary states, to march on Tenochtitlan. After a dramatic series of events, including initially being welcomed by Moctezuma, the subsequent Spanish expulsion, La Noche Triste, and a devastating smallpox epidemic, the Spaniards and their indigenous allies besieged Tenochtitlan. In August 1521, the Aztec capital fell, effectively marking the end of the Aztec Empire. The last emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured, and what remained of the Aztec state was soon absorbed into the new Spanish colony.
The colonial era, catastrophe, and resistance. The Spanish conquest did not immediately erase indigenous Mexico, but it upended the indigenous world in traumatic ways. The 16th century saw a drastic decline in the indigenous population, primarily due to Old World epidemic diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, etc., to which Native Americans had no immunity. Scholars estimate that in 1519, the population of what is now Mexico may have been around 15 to 20 million. Some estimates go much higher, but by 1600, it had plummeted to perhaps 2 million, a collapse of up to 90%. Whole communities were wiped out by disease. This demographic catastrophe, compounded by war, famine, and forced labor, was one of the greatest in human history. Despite this, millions of indigenous people survived and adapted under colonial rule. The Spanish colonial system, known as New Spain, was built on the ruins of the Aztec Empire, but utilized much of the existing framework. Indigenous towns were largely left intact under local rulers, caciques, though they answered to Spanish authorities. The Spaniards implemented the encomienda system, where conquistadors were granted rights to indigenous labor and tribute, with ostensibly a duty to convert and protect their wards. In practice, this often meant exploitation, although outright slavery of indigenous people was officially outlawed relatively early, leading to importation of enslaved Africans to fill labor demands, especially in mines and sugar plantations. Indeed, enslaved Africans were brought to Mexico starting in the 16th century, and their descendants intermixed into the population, contributing another thread to Mexico's genetic tapestry. The Spanish also imposed Christianity and colonial government. Catholic missionaries baptized millions of natives, sometimes preserving aspects of indigenous identity by syncretism, for instance, aligning local deities with saints. Indigenous languages like Nahuatl, Maya, Mixtec, and Zapotec continued to be spoken widely. In fact, colonial administrators often relied on translations and native nobles to govern the hinterlands. Indigenous elites learned Spanish and Latin script. Some indigenous scribes wrote chronicles and legal documents that are invaluable historical sources today. One critical aspect of colonial society was the development of a mestizo population, people of mixed indigenous and European and sometimes African ancestry. Initially, unions between Spanish men and indigenous women, some consensual, many not, produced a generation of mixed heritage children. Over time, these mestizos grew in number and formed an intermediate social class. The Spanish caste system classified people by their racial heritage: Spanish, Indio, Mestizo, Mulatto, etc. But these lines blurred as mixing continued. By the 18th century, mestizos were a significant demographic group, especially in cities in the frontier. However, it's important to emphasize that throughout the colonial period, the majority of the population was still indigenous by ancestry and often by culture. In many regions, particularly in the South, indigenous communities remained the majority and kept speaking their languages and maintaining communal lands. The ejido system has pre-Hispanic roots. They did face pressures: loss of land to Spanish estates, forced labor in mines and haciendas, tributes and taxes, and attempts to suppress idolatry, traditional religion. There were numerous indigenous rebellions and resistance movements. For instance, in 1541, the Mixtec War in Nueva Galicia, western Mexico, saw indigenous groups fight Spanish rule. Later, in 1680, there was the Pueblo Revolt to the north in New Mexico. Even into the 1700s, Maya communities in Yucatan periodically revolted, and far south, the Maya would later launch the caste war in the 19th century. By the end of the colonial era, early 19th century, Mexico's population had partially recovered. Most were people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, mestizos, but a large number were still fully indigenous, especially in rural areas, and a smaller number of pure Spaniards, Creoles and Peninsulares, and Africans or mulattoes. It's difficult to give exact percentages, but estimates around independence, 1821, suggest perhaps 60% or more of the population was indigenous, or predominantly indigenous mestizo, with the remainder being whites and others. Mexican independence and the indigenous majority. When Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821, the new nation faced the task of forging a common identity. The early leaders, many of whom were of Spanish or mixed descent, generally downplayed racial divisions by promoting the idea of Mexicans as one people. Over the 19th century, and especially after the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, an ideology of mestizaje, racial and cultural mixing, became central. Mexican intellectuals celebrated the country as a cosmic race, a fusion of indigenous and European heritages. They acknowledged indigenous ancestors, particularly the Aztecs, as a source of national pride, yet they also encouraged the assimilation of indigenous people into a mestizo mainstream. This meant that in official nation building, indigenous peoples were often expected to become mestizo by adopting Spanish language and culture. In practice, many indigenous communities continued their lifeways, but the national identity that formed was predominantly mestizo. Spanish became the sole official language, indigenous languages and traditions were often marginalized or looked down upon by the elite. Despite this, Mexico's population remained overwhelmingly of native descent. Only the cultural label shifted. Essentially, centuries of intermixing had made indigenous ancestry a common heritage among Mexicans, even if not all identified with an indigenous ethnic group. Modern genetic studies resoundingly confirm this continuity. A recent massive genomic study of over 140,000 people across Mexico found that on average, about 66% of the ancestry of Mexican participants was indigenous, with most of the remainder being European and small fractions African or Asian. This is a striking statistic. Nearly 2/3 of the genetic heritage in these samples came from the original peoples of Mexico, despite 500 years of colonial history. And moreover, the indigenous ancestry was not uniform. It reflected the contributions of many different native groups, especially those from central Mexico. Other studies of Mexican genetics have similarly revealed that the indigenous component is predominant. For example, research on Mexican Americans in the US, who are largely descendants of Mexicans, showed they have significant Native American ancestry, around 40% on average in one sample, with the rest mostly European. In Mexico itself,
Individuals from different regions carry varying proportions of indigenous DNA, but virtually everyone born in Mexico has indigenous lineage.
Genetic studies and indigenous legacy in Mexico. Advances in genomics have provided a new lens to view Mexico's history, literally written in the DNA of its people. Genetic research in the past decade has untangled the complex ancestry of Mexicans, underscoring how indigenous peoples remain foundational. One groundbreaking study in 2014 by the UC San Francisco Stanford team found tremendous genetic diversity, reflecting thousands of years of separation among local populations within Mexico. In fact, the differences between some indigenous Mexican groups were as large as those between people from different continents. For instance, the DNA of a Seri person from the Sonoran Desert and a Maya person from the jungles of Chiapas can be as distinct as that of a typical European and a typical East Asian. In particular, the Seri people along the Gulf of California coast and a Mayan people known as the Lacandan near the Guatemalan border are as genetically different from one another as Europeans are from Chinese, noted the study. This reflects how long these groups have been isolated from one another, evolving independently in different environments, likely for many thousands of years. Crucially, these differences were not erased by mestizaje. They are hidden among the European and African ancestry blocks in mestizo Mexicans, such that the indigenous genetic map still resembles a geographic map of Mexico. In other words, even people who don't identify with a single indigenous group, say a Mexican from Mexico City who considers themselves mestizo, carry within their genome segments that trace back to specific indigenous ancestors. If that person's forebears come from, for example, Oaxaca and Guerrero, those indigenous genetic segments will match the Mixtec or Zapotec or other local native signatures from those regions. The 2014 study reported 3 major genetic clusters in Mexico, corresponding roughly to West, likely Nahua or indigenous from Western Mexico, Central, likely Nahua or Otomi, etc., and South or East, Maya, plus evidence of the ancient empire's reach, as some DNA in far-flung regions hinted at past migration or conquest links. Another large project, the Mexico Biobank, recently genotyped over 6,000 people from all 32 states, the most diverse collection of genetic information in the global south. They were able to infer ancestral population sizes and demographic changes over 5,000 years, essentially mapping how indigenous populations grew, moved, or shrank over time. One finding was that the Yucatan Peninsula's people, predominantly Maya descendants, are genetically distinct and relatively homogeneous compared to central or northern Mexicans. This likely reflects how the Maya area, encircled by mountains and rainforest, received less outside migration historically, preserving its ancient lineage, whereas central northern Mexico saw more mixing, both among different native groups and later with Europeans or others. As one geneticist remarked, it's not the same being Mexican from the Yucatan region than being Mexican from Sonora in a genetic sense. The second part of that 2023 research, the Mexico City Perspective Study on 140,000 individuals, echoed the dominance of indigenous ancestry. Across their huge sample, about 2/3, 66%, of the genetic ancestry was indigenous. This confirms quantitatively that even after 500 years of colonial influence, the majority of the genetic pool in Mexico is of indigenous origin. The remainder was mostly European, with small admixtures of African, especially in coastal regions like Veracruz or Guerrero due to slave trade, and traces of Asian. Some Filipinos and East Asians came during the colonial Manila galleon trade, and more Asians immigrated in the 20th century. It's fascinating that Mexicans, in a genetic sense, are a mosaic of many peoples. As one article posed the question, "What is a Mexican?" it explained that Mexico's complex history,
involving pre-Hispanic civilizations, Spanish colonizers, enslaved Africans, and more recent immigrants, means that Mexicans have several different ancestries represented in their genome. Yet even with that mixture, the primary tapestry threads are indigenous. Modern genomics is essentially reinforcing what should be intuitive in a land where for millennia the population was 100% indigenous. The introduction of new peoples, Europeans, Africans, etc., was significant, but did not replace the native gene pool so much as add to it. The indigenous roots remained deep. One genetic study summarized that Mexico's population recapitulates Native American substructure, meaning the distinct native groups can still be discerned in today's genomes. These genetic insights also carry practical implications. Certain health traits or risks have been linked to indigenous genetic ancestry. For example, variants common in indigenous Americans are associated with higher susceptibility to type 2 diabetes, and the MXB study found that segments of indigenous ancestry, often having long homozygous stretches due to past population bottlenecks, correlated with lower body mass index and healthier levels of some metabolic markers in Mexicans. Such findings highlight why it's important to include diverse populations in research. If most genetic studies are on Europeans, they miss variants present in indigenous Americans that affect health. Thus, Mexico's genomic projects are helping improve precision medicine for Mexican and Latin American populations by acknowledging their unique genetic makeup. In sum, genetics powerfully underscores that Mexico is still overwhelmingly indigenous beneath the surface. It provides scientific backing to the idea that the Mexican people today are largely the direct descendants of the myriad indigenous civilizations that have called this land home. It's often said that we are still here by indigenous communities. Not only are they here culturally, but their blood flows through the majority of Mexicans, whether or not individuals identify as such.
Conclusion. Standing in the present and looking back, one can see an unbroken line, albeit sometimes frayed, but never severed, connecting the Mexico of today with its deep indigenous past. The first people arrived in Mexico tens of thousands of years ago, and their descendants achieved remarkable feats, domesticating corn, building great cities like Teotihuacan and Tenochtitlan, carving colossal heads and composing codices, mapping the stars and developing writing, governing empires and nurturing local villages. The Olmec, Zapotec, Mixtec, Maya, Aztec, and dozens more cultures all added their threads to the grand tapestry of Mexico's history. The Spanish conquest brought tremendous upheaval, but it did not erase those threads. Instead, it interwove new ones, creating a complex mosaic. Today, science has confirmed what Mexico's national folklore long proclaimed. The indigenous roots of Mexico run extraordinarily deep. In genetic terms, the average Mexican is mostly indigenous. In cultural terms, everyday life in Mexico is profoundly shaped by indigenous inheritance, from language to food to art to values of community. As one recent study emphasized, Mexico's genetic landscape still mirrors its pre-Hispanic civilizations, only lightly overlaid with later influences. The notion that Mexico is overwhelmingly indigenous is not a romantic slogan, but an objective reality, whether measured by DNA or by the enduring presence of indigenous people and traditions. Thus, the history of indigenous Mexico is not just ancient history, it is a living story. It's the story of a people who have continually adapted and survived, from the nomadic hunters of Pleistocene times to the villagers of the first maize fields, from the citizens of Monte Alban and Tikal to the warriors of Tlaxcala and the artists of Texcoco, from the oppressed colonized communities to the proud Oaxacan weavers and Yucatec Maya speakers of the 21st century. 500 years after European contact, Mexico remains, at heart, an indigenous civilization, a modern nation carrying the genetic and cultural DNA of its first peoples.
As Mexico moves forward, there is growing recognition that its strength lies in this very continuity and diversity. The indigenous past is not gone, it breathes in the present. The future of Mexico will no doubt continue to be shaped by the wisdom and resilience inherited from its first peoples, a heritage that all Mexicans, whether they identify as indigenous or mestizo, share and can take pride in.